So, if you hear this ignition, you know we are live. Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle. Napoleon apparently made the claim that England is nothing more and nothing less than a collection of shopkeepers. And of course, we can't ask him, he's no longer around. But I tend to think that was intended to be a derogatory comment. And I tend to think that the English didn't necessarily see it that way. But the question is, wherever you may be, what kind of nation do we have? You are listening to Radio Tipping Point, and our subject today is a nation of. Now, when I use this term nation, I use it very loosely. We have to remember that in the 60s, we actually made the claim of having a Woodstock nation. So that means this term can take on different meanings. There was a reporter in the United States by the name of Edward R. Murrow. And he made a claim way back when that a nation of sheep will beget a government of wolves. And I think following that of what Murrow said, that we can deduce this concept of nation as being something much larger. But the question is, so what kind of nation do we want to have? And of course, it doesn't have to take on exclusively one attribute. It could take on a number of attributes, and I suspect it probably will. But let's start with one concept. Do we want to have a nation of thinkers? And by that, I'm referring to critical thinking. Now, this idea of critical thinking is talked about as something that companies want to have, that we as a group of individuals within a society, that it's good to think critically. But my personal take is that those individuals who make that claim really don't mean it. That means that we're not interested in hearing contrary opinions. We do not seek contrary opinions. We are offended by contrary opinions. And we believe at the end that there's only one opinion. And that would be the one that, of course, we have, and that of our tribe, because that's where we identify, which is clearly no nation. But it's to be argued that this concept would be a game changer. Again, let's go back to the quote from Moreau, where he talks about a nation of sheep begets a government of wolves. What would your area look like if indeed we were to have more critical thinking, especially over the last 16, 17 months? That would mean that individuals would ask why. They would question to what degree the information they are receiving that is reputable. That does not mean that you are making a claim of what is right and what is wrong. But the idea is to have a healthy dialogue and the ability to actually learn based upon an opinion that is different from your own. So is that the nation we want to have? Are the conditions there for that type of nation? Or perhaps we want to be a nation of consumers. I shop, therefore I am. Just based on my observation, I believe that most people, or a number of people, would consider themselves to be part of that nation. Certainly based on their attitude, their actions, their intentions. So if we were to take those elements, those things that we observe as an indicator, then it looks like for a number of us, that's the kind of nation we want to have. Or maybe we are looking to have a nation of bureaucrats. That means that efficiency is completely our goal. We're looking always for clear direction. And if we're not sure, we go back to the rule book. It helps us in avoiding any possible conflict, certainly on a specific level. Is that a nation that we want? Very often when I look around, I think that is the nation that people are actually striving for. One of the problems, of course, over the last 17 months is that it's difficult to follow the rules. What are the rules? What rules apply? Are the rules valid? Let's not even talk whether those rules are meaningful and that those rules hold any value. But is that the kind of nation that we're looking for? A nation of bureaucrats? You are listening to Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and we are posing the question today, what kind of nation do we have? What kind of nation do we aspire to? So I ask you, are we a nation of humanists? And just to make sure that we are all on the same page, let me give you my definition. A humanist is an individual who puts the human condition in the middle of the equation, understanding where we are collectively, individually, where we want to be. And I would like to think we would try to figure out ways to improve that. And we've had some experiences here in Europe over the last couple of weeks, which was very interesting to hear from individuals who were very concerned about the floods, and of course the question always came up, either one, the proof, sorry, this is not a question, this is a statement. So if you were looking for a proof on global warming, here it is. And then, of course, the question was, who's to blame? But what I think seems to be missing in this equation is the question of what's it like for the people? And of course, you would see the reports of individuals trying to get past their current condition. But I would argue we really don't care about them. Their story is used for exploitative purposes. And besides, we'll hear a new story tomorrow. So for me, that is not humanistic in any way, shape, or form. And I would argue, if indeed we were striving to be a nation of humanists, we do not do a very good job. But that's what we are, aren't we? We are humans. And if anything that we should have learned over the last 17 months is that desire, that need, that longing for humanity. And we've seen that those who didn't at least have a sliver of humanity over the last 16, 17 months, it hit them the hardest. And for those who perhaps struggle with humanity, whereas humanity itself is not the culprit, but maybe the problem is within us. And we struggle to deal with a humanity that may or may not necessarily understand us. Although I think that humanity understands us much better than we want to give credit towards. Or maybe it's a question of not feeling worthy. Regardless, so are we a nation of humanists? Are we a nation of scientists? That was another interesting feedback or something to note that's been mentioned quite a number of times, certainly recently, that we trust the scientists. As if the scientists are not human. That the scientists can disagree. That the scientists are not infallible. And I think on this view, some of us belong to that nation of scientists and some of us don't. And that has been a major struggle, especially over the last year. Are we a nation of collectivists where we are focusing on the common good? Now, collectivism doesn't necessarily mean that everything belongs to everybody, contrary to popular belief. But it certainly does mean there are some things that belong to all of us. So is this something that we're striving for? I'm afraid this is another one where we're very, very far away. And it would make it so much easier to solve a number of the problems we have. And I'm not saying we take away private property. That's not the intention here. But it does mean that all of us have certain rights. I think we can all agree the air doesn't belong to anyone. Belongs to everyone. We used to think that water fell in that category, but today I'm not so sure. We know that land clearly doesn't fall into that category based on our actions. So what would that world look like if we were to perform some sort of paradigm shift and we were to start looking at those things that belong to everyone, understanding that everyone has this right? I bet you our policies would look quite different. But we have, unfortunately, a long ways to go before we actually get to that phase. Yes, the summer of 2021 is a time of introspection. At least that's our approach here on Tipping Points, where we raise the question, so what kind of nation do we have? Which kind of nation do we aspire towards? So if we're not a nation of collectivists, are we perhaps a nation of lethargists? That's a term that I've heard quite often lately, the idea that we're all afflicted of some sort of lethargy. Let me explain to you what we're talking about here with the term lethargy. That means that you still care, you're somewhat overwhelmed, you're very tired, and the motivation is very difficult. And I would argue that we currently are often a nation of lethargists. But then the question is that a temporary affliction, or is that something that we can actually go ahead and address? Well, I think the jury is still out on that. Because I think this problem of lethargy was one that we were already afflicted with way before March of 2020. That we're overwhelmed. That we lack the energy. That we have been conditioned to be passive. Last week I made my first venture as a participant in an actual live event. And the passivity of the people that were to be found in the audience talking about a subject that is anything but passive, well, it kind of floored me. And I wonder if maybe if this special occasion, actually getting out for a change after so many months in seclusion, maybe that made the passivity even more apparent. But it almost seems as if we have a nation of shell-shocked. And that is certainly not any condition that will help us move forward. So let me go ahead and pose a question to you. Are we a nation of reactionaries? Now, of course, this word reactionary can take on different meanings. The traditional definition is that we clamor for certain values that perhaps might not necessarily be part of our society today. And I'm not saying that they actually were around prior and they're not here today. But our standpoint is to hover back to something that is no longer there. Being against change would clearly fall into that category. And I would like to argue that we are not a nation of reactionaries. Very often the feeling we get based upon the statements of certain individuals might give you the impression that we are surrounded by reactionaries, but we have to remind ourselves that that statement is the effect. But I believe it's not the cause. The cause is something much more deep-seated. And that we could, by nature, never be a nation of reactionaries. And going back to the lethargy, perhaps that might be one of the reasons why we just can't handle it anymore. And that causes for certain reactions that we certainly don't think about. They appear to be instinctual. But to rely on instinct would mean that we would be much more reflective. And although we make the claim that that's something that we aspire towards, reflection, I tend to believe that's something that we would love to have, but we just simply don't have the time. But hey, it's summer. If there was not a time to reflect, then when is it? The American activist, sociologist, Professor Marshall Gans poses the question, so tied to this identity that we have, are we solely consumers or customers? And have we lost this identity of citizenship? Meaning that we belong to some sort of community. Now, within that community, it might not necessarily be a tribe, and I would hope that it would not be an exclusive tribe, but rather it would be an inclusive group. That would be open and would hold understanding. But the question is, what kind of nation do we have? What kind of nation do we ascribe towards? And there were a couple of phrases that I've mentioned so far in the show that could possibly be misinterpreted. Going back to this idea of lethargy, or of inaction. I would even go ahead and argue some of the points that I raised in the beginning of the program, tied to consumerism or bureaucracy, that these are the effects, but not necessarily the cause. So the question I'd like to go ahead and pose to all of you right now: what is the difference between passive and active? And by nature, we usually say that being passive infers that there is not much commentary, that you keep your comments to yourself, that there isn't much action that is coming from your side. And I would argue that that would be the traditional way of defining passive. But what about passive resistance? Is that passivity? Does that require no thinking? Is that not making a statement? Is that type of passivity possibly a source of contention? And passive resistance is something that is unfortunately somewhat out of fashion. I was listening to a story yesterday from somebody that I know who is very active within the plastic reduction field, among other activities. And she was telling me about a protest that was taking place in the Arbener Hafen in the 11th district. And I'm not going to name any names because that's not the point of the exercise, but there were certain groups where it kind of surprised me. They did not want to participate because they were afraid that it was a little bit too sensitive. And so the question is, so if we are not making a statement, and the statement can be tied to just an act of defiance, which is clearly our right. In the group that I had heard of, there's a younger group. If we don't have the feeling that we have the right, if we don't have the feeling that it's appropriate, then I ask you, when will we? And so with that, I'd like to leave those final thoughts for you right now. That maybe the biggest statement that we can make is simply not to accept those things that are part of this conditioning that we are continuously told this is what we should do. Especially if these acts of defiance cause no damage. And they might be the most effective form of activism I could think of. Then I would ask all of you right now to go out and cause a ruckus. Thanks for listening.